Alright, hello everyone. Before I get into this video, I wanted to make a little PSA slash disclaimer, but first, I'm gonna go get dressed for the occasion. Okay. It's been a few years. The PSA is this. Vinland Saga is a work of historical fiction. And even though it refers to many real-life people, places, and ideas, they have been heavily altered by the artist's preferences. As a result, in interpreting this, I have created several statements and sound bites which, if taken out of context, would give a very poor view of actual historical occurrences and potentially be insulting. Just want to make it clear, I stand by everything I say in this video as it relates to Vinland Saga, but it is not necessarily something you can extrapolate from with my view to real-life people and places. I shouldn't have to say that, but I still probably do. Also, kind of obvious, but spoilers for the first season. Everything that's been animated is up for grabs. Let's do this. Vinland Saga is pretty great. The production stumbled here and there, but all in all, it was a good story well told. I think most people are sick of comparisons to Berserk, and I don't blame them. Not only because it's overdone, but also unfair, with the stories coming from very different emotional places. Most stories are written with the assumption that the world is good and life worth living, with conflict deriving from an encounter with something that disrupts this vision of reality, not fitting in with the larger picture. And it's the hero's job to resolve this contradiction, either by getting rid of the problem, or bringing it into harmony with what they already know. The events of a story might be heartbreaking, but only through the implication that regular life is good and worth protecting. In a genuinely dark story, these assumptions do not exist. When something terrible happens, there's no real need to ask why. This is just how the world works. The hero is not attempting to resolve a contradiction. They are the contradiction. And the conflict arises from their attempts to protect something meaningful in the face of a universe that just refuses to cooperate. Or, in a few rare cases, take on the entire system and rebuild from the ground up. Getting back to Vinland Saga, I would not call this story dark. These might be hard times, but it's not a bad world, with trouble being local and temporary. Thor's died, but his party lived. Denmark is invading England, but most Europeans are at home on the farm. One village gets massacred, but 10,000 others have an uneventful winter. Vinland itself represents the idea that, as rough as things might get, the world is a very big place, and somewhere in it, a good life is always possible. A belief personified by Leif Erikson, a social outcast who found his place in the world by discovering a new one. And this is my real point. In Vinland Saga, we are dealing with an intact world. Man has not yet mapped the Earth, let alone created modern society. And when things fall apart, characters can reach for sources of meaning which most of us no longer have. Most people live among family in tight-knit communities, led by noble houses with absolute authority. Men who struggle together develop strong bonds and a sense of honor. And countries are united by ancient myths and legends, with great heroes of the past providing hope and guidance to their struggling descendants. We see each of these corrupted at some point in the story, but the damage can usually be contained, with characters having other supports to fall back on while they find a solution. Although there are extreme cases like Askeladd, who has a troubled relationship with all of these and gets through it by uniting them all into his personal narrative as the inheritor of Artorias. Or Canute, who suffers a total collapse and officially joins Team Dark, tossing aside everything he knew and vowing to start over from scratch, even if it puts him in the conflict with the very structure of the universe. Which, of course, brings us to the big one. When humans look for meaning in pain, few sources can compete with religion. And throughout the invasion, we see characters cope with tragic events by viewing them through the lens of their faith. Despite seeing everyone she knows get pushed into a mass grave, Anne keeps her peace with the world by invoking the idea of heaven, although she also loses the belief that she's going there herself. Then we have Willibald, who has a crisis of faith over his role in the massacre, as small as it was, unable to reconcile the universality of God's love with how little some men deserve it, eventually moving on by expanding his spiritual understanding until the violence felt small in comparison. It's moments like this which make the Berserk analogies so misguided. Guts cannot draw on a larger moral framework to explain what he's been through. It's just him and his allies against the forces seeking to destroy them. In Vinland Saga, a character might flirt with nihilism, but they can generally return to meaning through the help of their belief systems, although they might have to make some painful modifications in the process. This gets more interesting when you add pagans into the mix. His religion might be a simple one, but Thorkel is a true believer of a kind, treating battle as a sacred act and letting captured enemies pick up their swords for a chance at Valhalla. It's pretty convenient that his morals always justify what he was going to do anyway, but even in defeat, Thorkel acts as a proper warrior, protecting Thorfinn after their duel was interrupted and viewing his knockout by Thors as proof that he still had something to learn. Ironically, his devotion to war as an ideal makes him really bad at winning them, with Thorkel being so passionate about battle that he will actually defect to the weaker side to keep the fun going as long as possible. But, weirdly enough, none of his fellow Danes have a problem with this, which the show itself lampshades, because, even if Thorkel is out of step with his country's politics, he's perfectly in line with its values, behaving like the larger-than-life hero of an old legend, which he eventually did become. He is the ideal Dane, and a force of pure chaos, which really calls the logic of a Viking empire into question. And, just as Willibald had to undergo some painful growth to salvage his faith, Danish society goes through its own transformation. The war with England is pretty openly power for the sake of power, with Sweyn feeling no real need to justify the invasion, or put any thought into how it's conducted, carelessly sending mercenaries to abuse civilians and scoffing at the very idea of diplomacy. Much like Thorkel, Denmark is winning quite a few battles, but no lasting victory, always gearing up for the next conquest instead of taking care of what they have. And while this mentality works for a while, it all comes to a head when the king has his final confrontation with Canute's father. Forcing Askeladd to choose between Wales and Canute was an act of pure domination. And, while this shit might work in an isolated warrior kingdom, Sweyn has expanded into strange lands filled with people he doesn't fully understand. Namely, the Welsh, who are holding on to a much older understanding of politics which demands that leaders act with a certain moral authority, meaning that Askeladd would happily sacrifice himself to beat Sweyn's ultimatum and prove a point about what makes a true king. As a result, the crown goes to Canute, whose compassion and ability to forgive had turned Askeladd into a genuine ally, with the Welshman trusting Canute to show mercy after assuming command, in spite of the bad blood between them. For most of his life, Canute's people had rejected him as weak, effeminate, and overly involved with outsiders. Which is funny, because those are the same problems they have with Catholicism. And just as the prince reached maturity by sharing in Willibald's epiphany, his self-coronation marks the kingdom's transition into the world of Christian values, which they find alien, complex, and often dissatisfying, but which also provide the basis for a Danish politic which is gentler, more charitable, and capable of resolving conflicts without resorting to force. Now, assuming you aren't actually angry at what I just said, I imagine most of you at least raised an eyebrow. And I want you to hold on to that emotion, because I can think of someone who's feeling something similar. When he heard his father's last words, Thorfinn was at a crossroads and chose the path of Askeladd, fighting his battles, joining his band, and almost becoming more a son of Askeladd than of Thor's, to the point that standing between them, you'd be hard-pressed to identify Thorfinn's actual parent. Thorfinn had idolized his father, but the ambush shattered his understanding of how life works. And no matter how kind-hearted and wise Thor's was, he still lost, meaning that Askeladd was the one who knew how to fight and survive in this cruel world. Despite saying he's motivated by revenge, Thorfinn never takes Askeladd by surprise and insists on a proper duel, because this means the relationship will end at the exact moment that every lesson has been passed on. And Thorfinn has become the man who could have taken control of the situation which ruined his life. But even as Thorfinn goes through this bizarre apprenticeship, his master keeps showing other sides of himself which challenge Thorfinn's image of who he is. Beyond being tough and courageous, Askeladd is funny, creative, reliable, and capable of incredible empathy. Although that last one's pretty hit or miss. I actually find it hilarious that, despite Thorfinn responding with literal death threats, Askeladd is pretty openly affectionate with him. If the little edgelord was remotely receptive, these two would probably be high-fiving by now. And through these little moments of intrusive bonding, Thorfinn is eventually confronted with the horrifying realization that, while Askeladd might know the secret to becoming the world's biggest badass, at the end of that path lies the same serene zen which Thorfinn turned his back on with the death of Thor's, and that, in a way, the men were kindred spirits. Even more, Askeladd reached this level of contemplation after spending his entire life as a mercenary, where Thor's had benefited from years as a peaceful family man. Had both men lived the same lifestyle, who knows what might have happened? They'd probably be friends. Thorfinn reacts to this by ignoring it, doubling down on the conclusions he reached when he was 6. After all, if both men had this connection, then what did the ambush actually mean? And if he didn't understand Askeladd, then who has he been becoming? The problem, of course, is that if you don't learn, you can't grow. And Thorfinn keeps mindlessly losing duels until the Welshman flat out tells him that his mentality is the problem. Much like Thorfinn, Askeladd learned to become a warrior by way of a weird father-son relationship. But it didn't turn into a 10-year pissing contest because he never lost perspective. This was never about killing his father. It was about helping his mother. And after getting the skills he needed, Askeladd quietly took care of business and moved on to the next part of the story. This verbal beatdown was hard to watch, but he's tried to be nice about it for 10 years, and at this point, Thorfinn kinda deserves it. Being treated like a common thug after it has become obvious that you aren't would be pretty insulting. And the kid has so many examples of better ways to handle this. If you look at their party, every single member had their worldview shattered by something they couldn't understand, and each found their own way to grow, adapt, and re-establish meaning. While Thorfinn is essentially mad that Askeladd hurt his feelings, Askeladd himself has to deal with contradictions which are crushing. He's the legendary hero of Wales, but was born in a stable, massacres civilians, and is best friends with a Dane. But he accepts these with a degree of grace and continues his narrative. Unlike Thorfinn, who hasn't even processed the idea that Askeladd is a mercenary, and that, if anything, he should probably be mad at Floki. Many protagonists of dark stories, Guts included, are struggling to hold on to something which gives them hope and purpose when their natural state is complete and utter despair. Thorfinn has the opposite problem. His mother, sister, and home are all intact. There is a good life waiting for him in Iceland, and he could return at any time. If only he could learn to let go. But after digging in his heels for so long, Thorfinn has become totally trapped. This relationship is now his only real source of meaning, and admitting he was wrong might mean losing it. But actually defeating Askeladd would be the death of Thor's all over again. Only this time, he'd be doing the killing. After which he'd face a choice between cutting himself off from the lessons both men tried to teach him, or actually learning them and facing the guilt of what he did. How conscious Thorfinn is of this is debatable, but I do get the impression that he's dragging this out on purpose. In particular, I'd point to the scene where Askeladd was shot by Thorkel's archers. Thorfinn's response was just a little too involved. And if Askeladd was the selfish monster Thorfinn makes him out to be, this could have gone on for who knows how long. But the young man is ultimately freed by the fact that Askeladd cares about a lot of things, and his own life is not high on the list. Thorfinn keeps trying to live like Thorkel, an unshakable juggernaut who can just destroy the source of his pain. But that's simply not who he is. And just as Thor's death took away his innocence, the brooding cynicism which replaced it crumbles in the face of something it cannot hope to understand. Thorfinn desperately wants to believe that he can kill Askeladd and have that be the end of it. That the lessons he learned as a child were worth the price he paid for them. And that accepting the brutality of this world meant he'd never face that pain again. He desperately wants to believe he's the protagonist of a dark, nihilistic story. When really, he's just in a sad one. Alright, well, that's the video. I put a lot of work into this one. A little too much, if I'm being honest. And I have an announcement. I have a patron now! Thank you so much. This is a big deal. And because I only have one, they get the whole screen. And for the low cost of any amount of money, you can get up there too. If you like good videos, you can support me on Patreon. And if you like bad videos, I've got those too. Thank you very much. See you next time. The next video should be quicker, but that's not a high bar to get over.